Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking, yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name is Nesh Nikolic, and today's guest is Michael Ronin. He is the author of Modern Masculinity for the Conscious Man. Michael takes us down a journey exploring challenges of the modern man and how media has given voice to radical ideas that question or even threaten masculine traits. Michael discusses what is masculinity, the difficulties young men face with radical feminist views, topics of power, violence, what is the conscious man, free will, and even rites of passage. Today we have a thought-provoking and even controversial discussion at times, and I hope you'll enjoy it because I certainly did. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Ronin. Michael Ronin, a big thank you for coming onto the show today.
Nesh, it's a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's going to be a real treat.
I'm looking forward to really finding out so much about this book of yours, Modern Masculinity for the Conscious Man. But before we sort of delve into that, maybe it's a good place to start in terms of how did this book come about? What sort of led you into this space?
Yeah, so I'm actually a writer quite late in life. My life has actually led me down many, many different avenues. I've been a professional actor for several years, a teacher. I've been an account manager for a website development company, a baker, a farmer. What else? I've worked in publishing, and I've worked in banks and in government, and lots and lots of different avenues in my life. But the one thing that has captured my energy through all these years has been my thirst for knowledge. And I provide a little description of this in the book. I call myself a philomath, which is essentially, it's a lover of learning and studying. And I love to uncover and discover things which generally are not part of the collective awareness. And I've never been interested in becoming a subject matter expert and say ending up in academia, writing scholarly papers. And I have much preferred to have led a much more broad and varied life. My interest is in many, many different subject areas. And I prefer to live with real people who are grappling with how to get by from day to day and how to improve their lives and their families and their communities. So, for the last 2 years, I've been writing this book and synthesizing my research and my thoughts about the situation that men are finding themselves in this day and age. And hopefully I can synthesize that book down into an hour and a half of our conversation with each other.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. Look, one of the things that kind of jumped out at me in terms of having you on the show is this concept of masculinity and also the conscious man. I'm sure we'll touch into what that actually means, but masculinity is really a term these days that I think is in so many ways kind of fraught with danger. It's a scary topic to tackle, as is femininity. How do you go about discussing and talking about what is this idea of masculinity and in terms of modern masculinity as your book suggests?
Right. Yes, historically there have been two types of masculinity we can point to, which is traditional masculinity. and also modern masculinity, which is quite a bit different from the image of the traditional masculine male. But in today's world, men are experiencing a crisis in masculinity, and as a society, men are now regarded as, I would say, they are regarded as contemptible, broadly speaking. They're subject of claims of their masculinity being toxic, for instance, or of having male privilege, or of being potentially or actually violent abusers or rapists or deadbeats, or there are many issues that men are facing that are increasingly pressing, such as husbands being taken to court and receiving what the modern vernacular is calling divorce rape, and having their sons and daughters removed from their lives by the courts. There's the presence of men in colleges, which is declining precipitously and has been for the last probably 30 to 40 years. And once they get into college, certainly in the United States, which is where I'm living, they are one step away from being accused of some sort of sexual misconduct, and rather than facing criminal charges, are brought in front of a college tribunal to determine their guilt, and quite often are subject to expulsion. There are also increasing levels, or I should say decreasing levels of testosterone in men, quite worryingly. Male suicide is increasing, with more and more men, vastly more men than women, taking their lives. And it's a lot harder for younger men these days to find good, meaningful, well-paid, well-remunerated employment. And on top of that, they're juggling huge levels of debt, student debt. And then, of course, you've got the perennial problems of how to get sex and find love and companionship from choosing the right person in their lives. I focus on heterosexual relationships predominantly because that's what I am. I'm a heterosexual male. But it's advice is in short supply for these men as to how they can face their challenges. And so my hope with the book is to, I should say, my first hope is to equip them with the tools, the intellectual, emotional, spiritual tools that they need to meet the demands of this life. But going further than that, the book is, I wanted to write about the way the world works and the way that the conscious man interacts with that world and with himself. And as you alluded to, it's not a pretty picture. Something seems to have, you'll hear the deep inhale there, something in our culture seems to have reached a tipping point in our culture, in our collective consciousness, where people are becoming distressingly polarized and hysterical, if not basket cases. And I want to make sense of that for modern men, for conscious men, and how they can interact with this world, this post-COVID world that they find themselves in, so that it informs them and so that they can mold and adapt that world to suit the unfolding of their true nature. On top of that, my goal is to help men and women so that they can relate with each other in functional ways. And quite honestly, that means telling the truth about how they are behaving dysfunctionally. And these truths can sometimes be hard to hear. Plus, I want to bring people together. I want to unite ordinary people who are not part of the matrix to reclaim their lives and struggle with each other to create better conditions for the human animal to exist in. So that's in a nutshell why I'm writing this book. And there's stuff in there. It's very extensive. There's stuff about psychology, human development, human nature, human consciousness, mental health, societal norms, pretty much everything that can help or hinder conscious men in the modern age. So it's a long book. It's a 7 or 8 hour read, and it's written for men who choose to be well informed about their lives, because most of the time, as men, we wing it. We go through life and stuff comes up and we deal with it in the here and now, without potentially having made alternative plans or judged ahead of time how to react to certain situations. So this book is pointing out to the conscious man where the most serious and major pitfalls and obstacles lie in his life, and so that he can be well prepared to meet them.
Michael, you've touched on a number of different areas, and I can just imagine a lot of the listeners would want further context in these, because these are really controversial topics, things
Yes.
like, wages and inequality, whether there's, rates of sexual assault, men obviously being understood as being primary perpetrators, and my understanding that is what is happening. Allegations and how society deals with these things. Obviously, you've mentioned
Right.
men's suicide rates, continue to go up. I'm not sure whether that's the same for women as well. There's this kind of media polarization of terms like white male and
Right.
these really big sort of topics. Part of my job in interviewing is to kind of push these buttons a little bit further and find out some more, because these are hard topics to tackle.
Absolutely.
So maybe you can just talk a little bit about some of those and how you've approached them, and what your research, what you've found has shown up, because there's such a lot of bias, I think, in all of these spaces, and I think we're all just trying to grapple with these and make our own minds up. So I think having different voices is useful.
Yes. I mean, I go for it. I really go for the hot button issues and talk about such things as toxic masculinity. Of course, we've all heard of that. We've all heard of male privilege. We've heard of patriarchy. We've heard of the wage gap, gender studies. And I talk a lot about gender studies because it's important to realize that gender studies in colleges is not actually, I would say, a serious or an authentic and integrated form of study. It's more of a ideology mill for the feminist movement, and of course we can dive into that if you're interested. I go into that quite a bit in the book, because feminism is actually setting the standard for what it is to be a man in this day and age. And a lot of the things that feminism is insisting upon are actually detrimental to the full expression of a man's masculinity. I go into, as I referred to earlier, I go into the divorce and family courts and domestic violence, and how domestic violence is actually perceived to be predominantly and significantly male perpetrated, but when in fact it is there is a symmetry in how the genders commit acts of domestic violence, which perhaps your listeners will be surprised to hear, but the research bears this out. And of course, there's the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement has been instrumental in talking to men, insisting that men walk through life essentially on walking on eggshells. There is a very, very strong magnifying glass being aimed directly over men and masculine conduct in this world, and the claims of sexual abuse that women have been bringing into the light over the last few years hasn't been completely helpful. And I think the Me Too movement started out pretty much with good intentions and was then hijacked for the a feminist narrative. And and then, of course, I get into stuff about rape culture as well, specifically about college rape culture, but rape culture in general. Uh, and there's so much there's so much that I talk about. These are the hot button issues, and the first chapter on the book is devoted to feminism. It's about why do I focus on feminism? Because to most people, when they consider feminism, they consider feminism to be a movement for equality of the sexes. And I was a feminist, a male feminist, for 30 years of my life, and I believed firmly that feminism and the battles that the feminist movement was waging was in service to a fairer and kinder world. And I believed that that was possible, that once the inequalities between the sexes had been addressed, that this fairer, kinder world might well be possible. So I cared about women's issues, and I still care about women's issues today. And I'm certainly not anti-woman. I have to say that I place an emphasis on men and women treating each other with compassion and kindness and respect. And my interest is how, and this is the conversation I want to start, how do we produce a culture which fosters well-adjusted human beings, well-adjusted men and women? There came a time when I saw the light. I discovered, and I felt conned by feminism, which presented desirable rights for women, but absolutely and singularly failed to talk about any kind of responsibility that women might have, which would have contributed to social inequality, or if they had any obligations themselves to society or to men. There was no conversation within the feminist movement about any shadow aspects regarding themselves. So I view feminism, nowadays I view feminism very harshly, but I remain pro-woman. And of course, many
What's
of your
the difference there? What's the difference?
Well, the difference is that feminism is not actually about equality. And that's the point I'm trying to make. It presents itself as a social good in a way that's absolutely masterful, in a way that makes invisible and insidious the harms that it does. And it can do this because, as a society, we privilege the assumption that femininity, and by extension, feminism, is inherently full of goodness and beauty. And what this does is it indicates a presumed moral superiority. And by contrast, of course, men are just toxic ratbags. We're inherently problematic. And certainly with modern feminists, the claim is that men, and I substantiate this in the book, men have to be tamed and subdued so as to reverse all the historical past transgressions that they've committed against female kind, and then basically to step off the plate and allow the future to be female.
When we talk about topics being hijacked by feminism, is that an extreme side of feminism? It's almost like in so many ways, I think most people could appreciate some of the claims that we hear on television of being kind of just wild, and that's because usually the media selects wild claims. They're highly polarizing. They're really small bites. There isn't a sophisticated conversation, which allows for maybe the voice of feminism to have a wider conversation. It's almost like it's crammed into a really short bite size to try and catch something. And whether that's coming from people who believe in feminism, or whether it's the media just saying, "Oh, let's just get some clickbait." It's really hard to untangle these things, because it just feels like it's hard to know whose voice is this when when I see some things in the media, you know, sometimes it's just some absurd claims that I read about, and things are just not factual at all.
Right. Yes. Yeah, it's curious. I mean, there are two routes that we could go down here. One is to consider the history of feminism and whether it's always been this way, if it's always been, if it's always attempted to hijack the narrative and to shape masculinity. And we could also talk about, and you're quite right to make this observation, and I write about this in the book, and it's so important, I put it in my introduction, it's the importance of nuanced understanding. And, you know, certainly there are different aspects of feminism. Not all feminists are man-hating misandrists. I identify essentially three different types of feminists. The first are what I consider coffee house feminists, and these are feminists who are not necessarily malicious towards masculine interests or male interests, but have been misinformed by the feminist movement. These are the women and men who believe in the notion that men and women should be treated as equals. And this is what most people think of when they hear the term feminism. Most women who are fair-minded think of themselves as feminists, as equity feminists. And essentially, you could say that they're coffee house feminists who don't feel particularly oppressed. And you could probably have a conversation with them and make the suggestion that, well, hey, perhaps you're not actually a feminist, but you're more of an equalist or a humanist or an egalitarian, instead of focusing on a slightly positive appreciation of the feminine and a slightly less positive appreciation of the masculine. So a lot of women I would consider are equity feminists. At the other end of the spectrum, however, you have what are
and
gender.
My apologies, Michael.
Yeah.
That would have to be the majority, I'm assuming.
It is the majority, but they're not the most powerful.
Sure.
The most powerful are the gender feminists or the radical feminists, and they are actually the main drivers of the feminist movement in the 21st century. I've dug deep into what's called third and fourth wave feminism, and unlike coffee house feminists, they actually have a set of theories and philosophies specific to radical feminism, which I believe are very harmful to the fabric of a harmonious society. And these are feminists who willfully and knowingly harbor antagonism towards men and towards this harmonious society. And I'll just finish by saying that, so I mentioned that there are three types of feminists. You have the equity feminists, the radical feminists, and the third type of feminist is the judicial feminist, and they are the judges, the lawyers, the law professors who they operate kind of in the shadows. Not many people really understand or are focused on their activities, but what they do is they litigate change through the legal system as a mechanism of social engineering. And the aim is to advantage or favor women above men. And they either get the law changed, and where they can't change the law, they change the way the existing law is interpreted. So in answer to your question, are we being given an image of feminism which has been, like clickbait feminism, which just gets a lot of opposition and anger up? And I would say the answer is actually no. That the case is quite clear that the agenda of the radical feminists or the gender feminists is actually driving a lot of the social change in society, and I find this very troubling.
Yeah, it sounds like the equity feminists, if we use that term, which is really the majority of women, and there are men as well in that group, are quite happy to have those nuanced conversations and look at the topic and explore it in much greater depth and, do some, I suppose, conscious analysis or at least exploration about the hard topics, whether it's about wages or whether it's about, what the word white male privilege means, both today and historically, how domestic violence might show up and so on. There's traditional feminists that you describe, which is people who believe in trying to create greater fairness, but have more of a, I suppose, a say in being able to do that. So they advocate within, I suppose, putting strong argument together and lobbying for what they believe to be improved changes in whether it be legislation or law or how we do our culture and the like. And then there's the loudest voice, which is the radical feminists that I suppose have the biggest megaphone. They attract the most attention. I mean, I know that everyone that I know has heard of the arguments that the radicals sort of hold. That's almost been historically always the case, hasn't it?
It certainly has. Yeah. Well, just to pick up on what you were saying about equity feminists having conscious conversations about these hot topic issues, and I would actually say that they are having unconscious conversations. They're getting the narrative from the gender feminists without consciously doing the work to identify whether it is correct or not. And quite honestly, I was like that too. I was a feminist for 30 years, and I unconditionally accepted all feminist talking points, all attempts for legislation which favored feminist-directed actions. And I did so uncritically. And, that's on me. So I would say that because there is this, because feminism is a mass movement, and because most women identify themselves as feminists in a particular sense, and if they're largely unconscious and following the directives of a very small group of feminists, then their impact is therefore quite great. Whether they know it or not, they are propagating unhelpful policies and procedures and legislation and social ways of being that are unhelpful both to men and women. And I should say that this is not about me trying to puff up men's issues. I actually want to create a world which is where both men and women can look to each other and be fulfilled by each other. And I do believe that feminism is doing a disservice to women and is in fact making women less safe in the world, which I talk about quite a lot in the book.
It's almost, and my apologies here because I don't want to be changing your works, but it's almost, the book potentially could be modern masculinity for the conscious person, being that someone who could be informed and think about these concepts by actually making their own informed exploration and decision, rather than just swallowing whatever's sort of the loudest or most prominent in the media. I mean, it's something that I've grappled with in my mind, and I don't think there's ever an answer, is how do we go out and equalize, many jobs in this world, so for example, let me just use something, and this is obviously going to be a bit controversial. It's going to be hard to describe this. Let's say if we want, 50% of our police force to be represented by women.
Yes.
At the moment, I don't believe that's the case. I think there's more men in those roles. But there has to be a conversation about why is there more men? Is this something that men are a little bit more attracted to? Do people self-select in and out of these types of positions? Why are women overrepresented in, let's say psychology or in the helping professions, nursing and the like? There seems to be something going on that's not necessarily attached to just wages, but rather we tend to be kind of self-selecting, or at least on an average population basis, we're attracted to different things.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So I write about this. There's a big debate between the left and the right. There seems to always be this big debate between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And on the left, the consensus is basically that they want equality of outcome, and the right basically want equality of opportunity. And my contention is that we have neither, and that what we have are horribly distorted versions of both. So in terms of the equalization of the sexes and how women have made inroads into employment which were traditionally masculine, I point out the fact that the feminist movement only identifies those male-dominated professions which are high status. So more female politicians, more females in big business, and so on. Essentially, they want an equalization in the numbers of women in the apex jobs, and they're in favor of what you can call equality of outcome. So they want these to be 50-50, but there's no scrutiny placed on the fact that they're ignoring those jobs which are male dominated, which are at the bottom of the social rung. So there are considerably more pest control workers who are male, more grounds maintenance workers, more loggers, more crab fishermen, more refuse collectors. And strangely, you don't hear feminists arguing for equality of outcome in those professions. They have no interest in more women in those areas. They're not calling for social changes in that respect. So feminism caters only to the upper class or upper middle class women, elite women. And those women, I would say, well, let me dial back a little bit. So I make the contention, and this is again another hot button issue, that job preferences are very strongly linked to human biology, and when given equal opportunity to select a job or a career of their own choosing, men and women go for certain professions. So men tend to go for jobs which are centered around things, objects, things, and women go for jobs which are centered around people, and networking and connections. So on the one hand, you have the systemizing professions, and on the other hand, you have the empathizing professions. And there have been some studies which certainly the ones that I pull up in the book come out of Norway, which are absolutely fascinating, because Norway is a very, very equalized society. In fact, it's a highly it's a social democracy where feminism has led the way for many, many decades. So what you see is that men and women have equal opportunities to go for any job they want, with no barriers of entry based on gender or sex. And yet what we're seeing in Norway are most women, most of the nurses in Norway, 90% of them are women, and 90% of the engineers in Norway are male, despite both sexes having the same opportunities and no barriers of entry to either profession based on sex. So it seems that given equal opportunities and with our predisposition inherent within us based on our sex, we tend to gravitate to certain types of jobs.
So the radical viewpoint disregards those sorts of, I suppose, positions, and just argues a fairness across the board, that all positions should be, I don't know, 50-50. Is that what's being said, or
Yeah,
is it more?
they really want they want a society based on equal participation across all domains. And my contention is that would be to deny our humanity. And it's not going to serve either sex if that's the case. And I'm not arguing for a return to the 1950s where, women are chained to the kitchen and men go out and slay the dragon. We need to have a conversation about this, but we need to have a conversation about what it is to be a human being, what it is to be in one's masculine essence or feminine essence, and what that means. Because the studies clearly indicate that there are some powerful drives within us that direct us in certain directions in life, which are not, we're not identical to each other. So I would say that I was going to, I'm going down, my brain is going down so many different avenues. I would say that we need to have this conversation. And, there are some women who are going to want to be engineers, for instance, who have a passion to be an engineer, but need a little help. There are some men who are going to want to be nurses and have a passion to be a nurse, but they need a little help. Now, the right is basically saying, there's equality of opportunity, just go and compete for those jobs. And the left is saying, no, we will definitely make you an engineer, or we definitely want you to be a nurse or whatever. And I think that, again, it comes back to nuance. There needs to be a middle ground where, in terms of helping people achieve their own potential within themselves, I look upon it as the same sort of proposition we have for people who are disabled, and where you have equity hiring practices, which would mean that you would have two candidates of equal merit, and you would choose the one which would allow that, whatever it is, the school, the business, the government department, to accomplish its equity mandate by hiring that particular candidate that has belonged to a minority group that has been historically discriminated against. And I think that's pretty reasonable. That's pretty reasonable to my mind. But what we have right now is that there's been this mindset that has been developing, which absolutely positively favors the minority applicant. And women are considered a minority, even though they're 50% of the population. But the minority applicant is given the job at the expense of the more qualified person. This has been happening for the last decade or two, often with some considerable or subtle pressure from senior staff members. And what's been happening is that you have, and you can observe it, there's been this diminished competency across many fields of life, across many fields of careers. And to be quite honest, I think it is a little insulting to women by suggesting that they don't have to be any better than their uterus, and they just have to be female. Ideally, what we want is a world which holds women and other minorities to a standard of competency, rather than just affording them the top jobs they desire and the special dispensations just because they are women. I'm all for helping women reach a standard of excellency. I'm for helping anybody reach that standard so that they can become the person they want to be. But simply favoring women because of a perceived historical slight, I think, is doing a disservice both to them and to men.
Michael, is this fear of the radical voice unfounded? I mean, I look around and I think to myself, if I were to take 50 of the women in my life and I had a conversation with them, and I don't think I'm a particularly special or interesting outlier by any means. I don't know if any of my 50 friends would hold the very rigid, inflexible perspective around strict equality. I think they would probably voice an opinion more like yours, where we kind of say, look, there there are occasions where people might need to be propped up. In a social world, in a human world where we're humane and considerate and compassionate, that's what we do. We have a program called Social Security, and it doesn't matter what gender you are or age or anything. We try and support those. At the same time, maybe there is a little bit of a leaning towards things potentially may have been not so equal in the past, and there needs to be a conversation to explore or address those things. So maybe more people who need that little, support will get there. I'm not sure if anyone I know is holding that rigidity. I'm not sure. What do you think the average? And I don't even know what average means, but an average regular woman feels, or even man who believes that they're prescribes to being feminist. What do they think? The average person.
Yeah, again, I'm writing this for the younger male, the millennial male, sort of like the 25 to 35-year-old. And, I'm a generation and a half outside of his experience. And in my world, and probably in your world as well, I would agree with you. I'm not meeting that sort of antagonism or narrative. But in their world, it's very, very different. It's very different. And this is something I needed to document. And it's not just the attitudes that modern women are holding, it's actually the real world implications and the attempts to favor women above men being driven by the feminist movement. So, one thing you'll hear about is the wage gap. And, President Obama has spoken about the wage gap. Biden campaigned on reducing the wage gap. And there's the wage it's like one of these viral memes that keeps being spread around the internet, and you read it so many times or you hear it so many times and you start to believe it. If everybody's talking about it, it must be true. And quite frankly, it is not true. There is not a wage gap. What there is an earnings gap. Men earn more than women, but they receive the same wages. And essentially, feminists understand this, but they don't pay that any mind, because what they do is the way they calculate the wage gap is to add up all the money, all the wages that men make, throw it into one big pot and take the average. Then they take all the wages that women receive, throw it into that one big pot and take that average. And what materializes is a difference like 77 cents on the dollar that women receive compared to men. And in that very simplistic way, this wage gap materializes. But the thing is, there are so many different variables that are not being considered. Just this very simplistic calculation. So, for instance, women, they tend to leave the labor force to have a child or to look after their parents when they become ill or old. They select lower paid employment. Women generally select lower paid employment, but for lifestyle reasons. Teachers and nurses and the like are lower paid. They don't usually go for the STEM careers. They value, when women take a job, certainly in the USA, they value non-wage benefits more than men do, the insurance, the health benefits and so on. And when you take all of that, they earn less overall. And the point I make in the book is that logically, if women were doing the same job as men for less money, there would be absolutely no incentive for companies to hire men. Who would do that? Who would hire a man when they can hire a woman for 70 cents on the dollar? Companies are not stupid. They would definitely hire a woman with similar skills. So why would they pay a sex premium for a man? The only explanation would be that, and I'm being facetious here, companies are unconcerned about losing money and are deliberately paying men more because of like this commitment to advantaging men over women. Is that so that is not reality. I mean, take the shareholders of the company. So forget about the CEOs of the company. What about the shareholders? Would they be okay with the hiring practices of the company, whereas otherwise they might claim or expect profit maximization so that they can be paid their dividends? It doesn't match the real world. And yet you hear again and again and again and again and again, the wage gap, the wage gap, the wage gap. Now, unless, I mean, I've been sunk in this for quite some time, doing the research and so on. Most people are not that interested. There is this expectation, this assumption and credibility given to the feminist movement, and they believe it. They believe that if feminists are screaming about the wage gap, there must bloody well be a wage gap. Why would there not be? Why would they scream about something that was false?
Michael, you raise a really strong point there, and if I could just pick up from something what you've said just a moment ago as well. You wrote this book for a younger audience. It's the modern masculinity, and I think that's probably where I'm out of touch. Just reflecting as you're talking about it, I know at the moment in Australia there's this big campaign around sexual both sexual and domestic violence against women. And every night there's a show on domestic violence, there's a show on sexual assault, and it's publicized strongly whenever there's an allegation against someone. It's kind of like everywhere, and I didn't think about it because I just filter so much of this stuff out of my brain. I kind of try and be a bit more objective and kind of consider, well, I don't have any of the information. It's all just little bite sort of snippets that I'm not privy to the information. But maybe the modern man or young man does not have those faculties to go out and decipher, or the modern woman, young people don't have those faculties to to read through the lines and question this stuff. And what you're saying is we need to be the conscious man or person and start questioning. Well, in actual fact, question everything. Question whether it be the feminist that asks for equity or is radical or traditional. It doesn't matter. Just question all of them and find. Have a deeper conversation. Do your research. Think about it some more rather than being an echo chamber.
Yeah.
Because young people at the moment are just absolutely being hammered by these really kind of extreme views, and it's not just from feminism; it's just in general. It's kind of these if I can call them mad, polarizing viewpoints that are extreme. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. It could be about religion or something. I mean, these days in Australia, I think most young men are probably rejecting spirituality, religion, as young persons, at least on the average.
Oh, right. Yeah, a lot of things to touch upon there. So we accept on faith the information that's presented to us, and this is the second half of my book. I go into there is a war on consciousness being waged, a war on sense making, which I get into outside. This is not about feminism. This is just about the broader social forces within society, which are attempting to shape our consciousness and our perspectives so as to control the agenda and to have
Can
the
you
sort of
talk about that a bit more in terms of what that war is, how we are being shaped, especially our young generation?
Absolutely. Not just our young generation. Everybody
us too. My apologies. Good point. Well done.
Maybe this is not so new to you and me, but my contention is that there are countervailing forces which want to control you and do not want you to become more conscious, to see things with greater clarity, to see reality as it really is, and then potentially to do something about it.
What's
The
interesting there, I'll just jump in. My apologies
yeah.
for interrupting, but it just shows how ageist I just was. It's almost like, oh, the young people, they don't know anything.
Yeah.
It's almost, the dumb ones. It's interesting how, there isn't a faith in my language and in my thought that young people can do this, when in actual fact, they're the next generation.
Yeah.
Very bright, extremely bright, and probably more equipped for the modern world than I will be, right? So it's just fascinating just to pick up on that.
Yeah, it's curious because we talk about the dumbing down of America. I live in America, so we talk about the dumbing down of America. But of course, when did that start? When did they start dumbing us down? And I'm sure that your generation and mine has been dumbed down to quite a large extent, even to prior generations. So, by what metric do we judge ourselves in terms of how conscious we are, how aware we are, how intelligent we are, how good we are at making sense of the world around us? Free thinking individuals don't fit the agenda of the control system. And these control systems that are in place are meant to, I believe, repress the full realization of our humanity. Um, the paradigm we live under requires us not to think too hard about these control mechanisms. And, all that's needed is functional, obedient students or workers with only as much intelligence to perform the tasks that have been assigned to them. Pink Floyd recorded the album, and I forget the name of the album now, but they talk about bricks in the wall, and that's what they want. They just want bricks in the wall. I come from a very progressive background, and a lot of my book has a class perspective. I view the world in terms of a ruling class and the rest of us. And when you look around us, when you see the disparities in wealth, um, and how the wealthy own the disproportionate resources and have claimed them from Mother Earth, this basically, I tend to accept my own bias or story, if you like, about how the world is constructed. It's constructed for the rich and not ordinary people. So my contention is that a conscious man, if he's to come into the fullness of his being as a conscious man, he doesn't just have to do his inner work. He also has to contest with the control systems put in place by the ruling elite that seek to repress the expression of his true nature. It's in the natural order of human beings to evolve their consciousness, I believe. To become more and more conscious. It's how we're built. We're built to become more wise, more intelligent, more aware, more knowing, more loving. And as we do that, in doing that, we meet the control system, which fights back. And so I'll just say a little bit about what that control system is. And the one example I'll give right now is for instance, the mass media. The ruling elite's greatest success has been in molding each individual's perceptual frame of reference through the mass media. And what they do is they transfer narratives to the human mind via mass media. And that gives us a cultural paradigm which Carl Jung used this description. He talked about mass man, M-A-S-S, mass man. And essentially, mass man is the unconscious man, the man that just goes around living his life, not really questioning his reality. And so that the cultural paradigm in that case gives the mass man a blueprint, which he believes is his own creation, but which has actually been constructed for him to buy into. And we can see it all around us. We see it in our children. Our children. And this is, I was a teacher for several years, and it breaks my heart to see how children receive distorted social programming through the educational system. They receive it through their parents as well, in form of, the kind of generational indoctrination that they have received. But more than that, kids receive media through their devices, through their computers, their cell phones, and their spirits become progressively corrupted by the narratives that are fed to them. They are, the internet, for instance. The internet has been it's been a double-edged sword. It's been the key instrument for consciousness raising and the workings of the world. We now have, in fact, in our back pockets, access to pretty much all the information that's ever existed. In our back pocket, we can access that information should we choose to. That's incredible when you think about it. But the thing is, that does not serve the interests of the ruling elite. So behind that have come the efforts to control and corrupt and surveil us and regulate us and censor social platforms like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, and go after net neutrality, and all the while the digital media that has been algorithmically designed to feed certain narratives to our children, I'm sure is we're saving up a lot of corruption for the future in terms of how we meet dysregulated human beings.
Well, it's interesting because, all of my views are on the internet and they just keep getting repeated to me because as I do my searches, it doesn't matter what topic I'm looking at, these searches keep coming back to me. So if I'm looking for, I like the outdoors, if I'm looking for camping gear, when I go to YouTube, a whole lot of camping stuff comes up and I seem to like that. So I seem to watch that and therefore more comes up. But if I look at some sort of, I suppose, political viewpoint, the same thing continues to display back to me. And so it ends up being this really strong, narrow view of the world that it appears to me as though I'm right, that what I'm thinking others are thinking, when in actual fact, it's just, others like me are thinking, and I'm just being displayed them and they're capturing my attention. So I'm more likely to click on it. And it just goes round and round. It's not really allowing me to go out and see greater breadth, psychological flexibility, to then have the ability to respond to the world, from multiple perspectives rather than just a repeated set of viewpoints.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, as modern women, we essentially live in an echo chamber of our own belief system, our own interests, and very rarely get to examine arguments from different perspectives. So what we see around us, and this is why the world is so polarized, what we see is confirmation bias on steroids, where people are in their own tribes and actively seeking to confirm what they already believe and condemn contrary information to that belief system, and attempting to actively discredit what they think is hostile opposing evidence coming from others with a capital O. And it's so difficult. Pretty much everybody has a political position. You have yours, I have mine. And what we see around us is are people at war with each other over their perception of reality, reaching for an understanding of objective reality as opposed to our individual subjective perspective. That requires extending our perspective and perception wide enough to synthesize other coherent perspectives and realities. So to continually question our own perspectives, it is troubling to the human organism. We have to come face to face with stuff which is painful. Either from within us, we have to come face to face with our inner resistances, or we have to come face to face with other people who are challenging us, confronting us, perhaps giving us the message that we are in some way wrong or bad or shameful or a white man, and we try and avoid condemnation. And we do that by seeking out our own tribe, our own little corner of the internet where everybody thinks the way that we do. In a more social, in a more enlightened environment, we would be living in a society where tolerance for disagreement would be the norm, and where we would recognize our differences, and find common ground between us, because none of us, there are 7 billion people of us on this planet, and no two of us have the same opinion about anything under the sun. No two blades of grass are the same. So how do we live with each other if we all have our own version of reality, all 7 billion of us? How the hell do we live with each other? Do we go to war with each other, or do we find a mechanism by which we can take each other's best interests as our own, as important as our own best interests? So Nesh, if you have a particular perspective and I have a particular perspective, how can I fully understand where you're coming from? And rather than try and win an argument or win a political objective, make sure that you're not hurt in the process, that your best interests are cared for in a compassionate way, in a wise way, that we create a society where we don't try and outcompete each other. You have left against right, and the environmental movement against the people who want to direct the economy more towards extraction of fossil fuels or whatever, hydrocarbons. So many different cliques and aspects of society are warring with each other. We're tearing ourselves apart as a species. And my contention is that we are, if not at end times right now, we're precipitously close to it. And if we don't do something, if we don't find better ways of relating with each other, talking with each other, collaborating with each other for the social good, for the good of each other, not just taking care of number one, then we are facing our demise as a species. There's no getting around this. And I do talk about this in the book, because to ignore it is to embrace the possibility of failure. And I don't want to do that. I have a passion for the maximization and the optimization of our human nature. I love the human being. I don't love dysfunctional human beings. I don't love the way we relate to each other as human beings, but in terms of what we are capable of as human beings, should we have, the wisest teachers, the best environment that we grow up in, the most coherent, intelligent parents who direct us with love rather than coming from their own agenda, who bring us up to be who we are, not who they want us to be. So many currents, so many social and cultural currents that we need to contest with in order to unshackle the human being.
Michael, summarizing some of that is, and please jump in and correct me where I've gone astray a bit here, is for the modern masculine man, part of their responsibility is to listen, but also ask questions, then listen again, maybe ask some more questions before they make up their mind. And in some sense, when you've made up your mind, don't hold that tightly either. Continue to still seek objective, well-researched or logical, reasonable means in which way to measure opinions or perspectives to try and make sense of the world. And that could also mean emotions and feelings as well. So you can find a space that you can live by or live from.
Yes.
To not be, I suppose, a product of the social current, but rather be your own product.
Yes, very well put. And in fact, I think younger men are better at it than our generation, to be quite honest. They're much more in touch with their feminine aspect. This has also created, there are pros and cons to everything. modern men are, how shall I describe this? Compared to the boomer generation and taken as a whole, men's ability to contribute their energies to the world has been in decline for decades. They have a diminished ability to earn a good wage. They have these levels of debt, and they try. Men. Well, I should say that masculine. Let's just define masculinity pretty quickly. Masculinity is an energy which is penetrative. Very hard word to say. It penetrates. Masculinity is a penetrative energy, which is outwardly directed. It's a force which alters and develops and modifies and recasts its environment for good or bad. And its opposite, femininity, receives and surrenders and flows with change, wisely or unwisely. So in today's world, that penetrative energy it's very difficult to express it, because men express that energy through their passionate endeavors. And if they're chronically under-resourced by an anemic economy, high cost of living, many of them are still living with their parents, even if they don't want to, because because the costs of housing is so high, and also because they lack a confidence in their own spirit of independence. That coupled with this anti-male bias in society, men are becoming more and more passive, whether they want to or not, and they've begun to internalize the idea that their masculinity, their very maleness, is harmful to the world. It's unhelpful and unwanted. So, yes, they're very good at listening, active listening, and giving space to certainly their peers and to the women around them. The demand is that they step off the plate so that women can rise and meet their potential. So they're very sensitive to that perspective as well. But it's at the expense of their masculinity, that this passivity that they now inhabit within them. They don't nowadays, that they don't derive their sense of manhood from other men, because many of them have never met a male role model. A large number of boys are growing up in single parent households, most of which have a mother rather than a father. Most of the teachers they encounter in school are female. They're becoming, and I would say this is both a good thing and a bad thing, but they're becoming softer in nature over time, more compliant, more accommodating. And partly this is due to a changing world. We don't have to go and hunt our own food anymore. We don't have to go and chop firewood and build a fire and, all the things that required that sort of masculine intent, a strong man who would grapple with perhaps a harsh environment. Nowadays we can go to the supermarket and buy that meat. We can turn up the thermostat and increase the heat in the home. We don't have to build a fire. We don't have to saddle a horse and ride it. We can just jump in a car, much easier. So men are becoming softer just because the world is changing. The world is not as hard as it used to be. So men don't need to be as hard as they used to be, and they're becoming softer. And that means that they are finding it very difficult to come into relationship with their masculinity, with, what it means to be masculine, to be directed and to be strong and focused and rigorous and grounded, and discerning and self-disciplined, all of those things.
Yeah, Michael, there's something about that real strong masculinity state. I went on a 4-wheel drive trip recently, and my friend and I got stuck in the middle of the bush, and it was 10 p.m. and we tried everything to get out of this ditch. We were bogged. We had to use the winch and we're snatching from one vehicle to another. I blew 2 tires and I was still trying to drag my other friend's vehicle out, and we're out with shovels and there was mud, and it was 1 a.m. at that stage, and it was absolutely exhilarating. You know,
Yes.
at the end of it,
Yes.
we got out after 4 hours, and I haven't felt so alive. You
Right.
know, I remember
Exactly.
we got him out, and we both got out of our cars, and we, you know, hugged and embraced, and we, you know, smacked each other a big high five, and we screamed, and we're like, yes, we've done it. We're like just men, like real primal men, and it wasn't with harming anyone or anything like that. We were just
Right.
trying to get
Right.
out of, you know, problem solving. You know, we were down and
Yes.
out, and it was exciting. I haven't felt so alive for a long time.
Oh, so
I
good.
yearned to do more of it. It was really a powerful moment, and
Right.
that's that masculinity that you talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's such a good point. And how do we come into contact with it? Because you see, I don't know if you've read the book. I forget what it's called now. What was it called? Uh, not the Power of Myth. It was the other one. It was the King. Oh, it was a King, Warrior, Magician, Lover,
No, I
and
haven't.
it's an excellent book. It's I think Robert Moore was the author of that book, but he and his co-author wrote about traditional rites of passage that indigenous peoples teach a
Yes,
boy
yes,
and how to become a man. And you know, and I again, I think this is nuanced. The authors of the book saw that as a wholly good thing, where there is this transition from boyhood to manhood, and the rites of passage were oftentimes where the boy would be facing some situation where they potentially were in a life-threatening situation, or where they were in enormous pain. Um, you might be familiar with the sun dancer Native Americans who uh, insert eagle claws into their pectoral muscles and hang from a rope. And this is a rite of passage. In South America, there are certain tribes which place the boy on a nest of fire ants, and he has to endure the pain for as long as possible without complaint. And these things are meant to remove the boy and bring the man into hither being. And I have some concern about that, because what these rites of passage do is they teach the boy how to. They do two things. They teach the boy how to dissociate, and as you know, as a therapist yourself, you'll know what that means, and how to ignore his body, and that is the root of trauma. Um, they also they also help the boy to see himself as disposable, as to being of less value uh, to women. You know, a lot of the male programming over in history has been about procreation, protection, and provision, and also disposability. So our role as men is to protect and provide for women and tribe and family, and if necessary, to suffer and have our lives taken from us in seeking to do that. We have, you know, we sacrifice ourselves in wars by the millions, quite happily, many times. You know, think of the millions that died in the trenches in World War One, because they were because this was in service of family, women, and country. And this sort of this concept of disposability is actually invisible to most people, yet it's in the warp and weft of society, and we don't realize it. Um, so the rites of passage essentially teach the boy to be disposable, to think of himself as disposable, and to protect the tribe, even at the cost of his own life. Um, but yes, there is this thrill of being a man, of coming into one's power, of being there to stand up and fight the good fight, whether it's against a machine stuck in a ditch, or you know, hiking the Appalachian Trail, or you know, climbing Mount Everest. All of these things you could consider rites of passage, where we're challenging nature, challenging death, looking death in the face and shaking our fist at death and saying, just try and take me.
It's very much like that. As you talk about that, so much of that resonates about who I am as a man. This idea of sacrificing, and maybe that's why I work such strong hours, such large hours, and and for me, it's so much of it is tied up to my family. That I'm doing this for my wife, I'm doing this for my kids, and I'm not suggesting that I don't get a thrill from that as well, but maybe because I identify that way.
Right.
It's kind of like putting yourself in harm's way. I'm reading Matthew McConaughey's Green
Oh,
Light
right.
book at the moment, and he
Good.
spoke about a rite of passage for him was when his father gave him an opportunity and he didn't take it which was to be honest. He wasn't honest with his father, and his father sort of condemned him on that, and that was his opportunity to be become a man, to own up on something. And then he spoke about another point where another man put his hand on his father, and Matthew physically beat this guy up, and he spoke about that's when I became a man in my father's eyes, and how important that was. And I'm not suggesting, I'm not encouraging people to be violent or anything, but I appreciate how important it is for a man to get the approval of their father in particular, whether it's swinging a hammer and building something, or
Right.
doing something that's powerful, strong, maybe sports, kicking a goal.
Yes.
There's something there, and obviously the nuance is between doesn't need to be physical violence, or can be controlled physical violence like sports. There's such different worlds, and require conversation and clarity around them, so that rites of passage aren't about men learning to be men through aggression and violence. And maybe that's where there have been times, or society has shown that has been the case for many as well, and we're trying to support those young men to find, and older men as well, to find a better way to hold their responsibilities.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, well, you talk about violence and aggression, and I'd like to make the distinction between the two of them.
Please.
So I think aggression is a healthy masculine trait. It is not in itself inherently problematic, whereas violence can be. Violence maybe points to a wounded man. So there's that distinction. And one more thing I want to say about that rite of passage is that we are born as boys, but we have to claim manhood, and women don't have this same journey. Masculinity is generally constantly in pursuit and in constant defense of manhood, because think of the phrase, you've probably heard it, it's probably been said to you, and certainly has been said to me, but be a man. When someone is trying to shame you, they say, be a man.
Yes.
And some men are shamed by both men and women for not being a man, either for not comporting themselves as a man who is exhibiting typical masculine traits, or someone who carries beliefs and values which are at odds with others. But you never hear the opposite. You never hear the phrase, be a woman. No one has ever said that. No one has ever said, be a woman, because and what that suggests to me is that manhood is different from womanhood. Manhood is not automatically granted just by having a virtue of a penis, but womanhood doesn't have to go through that. And at any time in a man's life, our masculinity can be challenged. We are constantly in pursuit of that manhood. It's profoundly impermanent.
Yeah. And maybe women get it in from the concept of, be ladylike. And I don't know if that's a term that's used anymore.
Right.
But just touching on the rites of passage, one of my professional idols, Stephen Hayes, I remember just recently reading an email that he sent through talking about our responsibility these days, the to kind of in the way that we shape society. And he kind of did a bit of a play on words around this idea of responsibility and, you know, being conscious, being aware, being psychologically flexible is to, you know, grab your response ability. You know, this ability to be able to respond. It's almost like the rite of passage is when you are maybe looking to your parent for what response should I be making, and doing it maybe clumsily when you try versus kind of becoming a man and saying, I can actually now hold my own values and my ethics and my morals and, you know, maybe my family name or whatever it is that's important in my culture, and act in accordance, you know, in response to my abilities and doing them wisely and well.
Yeah. Well, I would say that's probably I would say that's the cornerstone of what a conscious man is. It's someone who is responsible both for himself and also sees a place for himself in broader society. So, you know, I should actually probably define what a conscious man is. I think we kind of maybe
Please do.
didn't go into that. So a conscious man is a man who has free will. He's capable of having his own thoughts rather than the thoughts that have been internalized from prior conditioning by other people. And so his journey is to ask himself, you know, what programming do I have? What distortions and illusions am I carrying inside me? What thoughts are holding me hostage? And at that point, he starts an investigation into his belief systems and his limiting ideas about himself and the world around him. You know, I think of it in terms of him being a private investigator of his own experience. For instance, you know, oftentimes in life, someone says something or does something and it upsets us. We get triggered. We have an emotional reaction to something, which is potentially out of proportion to what is going on in the here and now. But so, and you know, all of us have experienced that. But for the conscious man, that gives him an opportunity to become the private investigator of his own experience. He can ask himself about the processes that influence his sense making by asking himself, not just, you know, so he can ask by asking himself certain questions like, how does my mind actually work? Not just what do I believe, what do I think, but how did I form my thoughts? How did I form my beliefs? By what processes? You know, how do I make decisions? How do I reason and think? It's kind of meta thinking. You know, in contrast to that, you have the unconscious man who, and I'd say a lot of us are like this, you know, even though we can experience life consciously, it seems that we're largely predisposed to being in an unconscious state of thought and behavior. You know, we carry these scripts, internal and external, and the programming that we receive from our society and our culture. And the people who are unconscious, who remain unconscious, are those who have never questioned or unlikely ever to question their programming to any great extent, and whose lives are strongly colored by the values that society tells them are worthy of pursuing, like consumerism, for instance, competing with the Joneses or whatever it might be. And we place so much of our identities on these labels and these limits and what it means to be a certain person in this world. And this is why I write about true nature, and our journey is to step into our true nature and discover it within ourselves.
I like the idea of true nature as well, Michael, because I think I've got a bit of a leaning towards the evolutionary biology model, and true nature to me also suggests being true in one's own context. And as the context changes, the modern man is living in a different world than what I grew up in and what you grew up in. And so the modern man will be different to you and I.
Yes, yeah.
He will ask himself and have his own thoughts around what does it mean to be a man. And
right.
like you and I did. Maybe when I was growing up, to be a man was to be, physically strong and maybe even violent with others. And maybe the new modern man, or another modern man, my apologies, explores that differently. And we hope on average, and as the context changes of this world, and obviously we're in a very, very technologically advanced world in comparison to even 50 years ago, the modern man has to be different than you and I.
Yeah, absolutely. So
His true nature will be different.
Yeah. So I give an analogy in the book, a metaphor about just as the image of an oak tree is inherent in the acorn, this relates to our true nature. We have within us an intrinsic aspect, just as the acorn has an intrinsic aspect of the oak tree. But it depends where you plant that acorn. If you plant it in different environments, it'll grow up representing something very different had it been planted in one environment or another. So, modern man is being implanted in the modern world and is growing up in this environment. And given another environment, he will exhibit different aspects of who he is in the fullness of his being. But behind that, the true nature doesn't change. Behind that, and I talk it, so this is where the book leans into a little bit of a spirituality. And spiritual awakening is where you have a level of awareness of who you really are, what your divine nature and animal nature, actually, to that extent, what your divine nature really is. It's about taking the awareness of your true nature and, not simply saying to yourself, oh, that's interesting, but actually living the truth of your nature. It then becomes transformative. And it takes integration and embodiment to live from your true nature. How shall I say it? It's important to, look into ourselves, to reflect on ourselves and discover our true nature so that we can engage with life with personal integrity and authenticity. And, I talk about it, honoring our path of personal mastery in the book, which is, that's a very masculine context of having a path, having a code of honor and a mission to fulfill in life. Eric Fromm spoke quite strongly about this in his work as well. We have this personal path of mastery of right thought, right word, right action, right intent, to borrow from Buddhist thinking. And the thing is, we focus on what works best for us, what's unique to us as the unique individual that we are, what our unique aptitudes are. And this is the path of purpose. So it doesn't matter what the environment is. We simply come in touch with who we are at our core, at our essence, and seek to implement those things that are inherent within us, having the self-awareness to figure ourselves out and the courage to live from that expression.
It's really interesting just listening to how much of that language is so masculine as well. Like even the word mastery. Maybe I'm looking into it too much, but it's so masculine. Men love mastery. I'm sure women do as well, but there's something in there, and I can't obviously speak on women's behalf, but there's something there. Right thought, right intent, right action. Men love this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I may be projecting, Nesh, but when you just talked about that, it sounded like you found that a little bit problematic, that talking about mastery is something, and tell me if this is a projection, but there was some doubt in your voice about whether or not that's a good thing or not.
No, look, I love it. I mean, I think, mastery is so much around mastery is about, having a purpose, having direction, having meaning in one's life. I mean, I watch my daughter every day trying to do a handstand, and all she's trying to do is handstand and master it.
Right.
And I'm
Yes.
constantly applauding her, wanting her to do more and more. So I know it applies everywhere, but that word, maybe it's just my own lived experience. I love mastery. You know, I want to be the best. You know, I want to try the hardest. I want to do well, and maybe, you know, I want my parents to be proud of me. I'm not sure where that all comes from, but that's a strong thing for me.
Yeah. It's holding space. This is a divine masculine trait. Is holding space for others. You know, I give the metaphor of a number of metaphors, like, you know, when you're playing catch with your kid, when you're playing ball, you know, you don't throw the ball at him full force. You throw it according to his capabilities, and you catch it according to his capabilities. Or when you, let's just imagine that your wife is learning how to paint, and it's a windy day, and you're standing next to her, and you're holding the canvas steady as she paints. This is holding space for her. And men have this capability of holding space for others. You know, we hold back our orgasm so that the woman can rise to meet her orgasm first. This is holding space for our woman.
It transcends so many different spaces, doesn't it? It's interesting to explore the complementary nature of men and women. I know we haven't had much time to look at that, whether it's, sexual connections or, connectivity, or how men can be available, for their partners, both male and female. It's interesting to see the dynamic, because clearly there's a dynamic out there that nature continues to produce.
Yes. Yeah, it's quite magical, and this, I'm not just focused on how men and women relate dysfunctionally in the book. I also talk about what high-level relationships, highly evolved relationships look like, and how men and women can bring themselves into alignment with their opposite sex.
So much to talk about, Michael. I'm cognizant that it's almost midnight where you are, so probably do need to wrap it up. But where can people find out more? Where can people also get your book?
So I have a website, michaelronin.net, and people can get in touch with me there if they read the book and have any questions about it, or want to share any of their experience with me. Please contact me through the website. I don't really do social media. I find it generally very dispiriting. It brings out the shittiest version of people, and I don't really want to be in that environment. So I have a website. I'm also on Goodreads, which is a book website. I have a profile there where people can contact me, and the book is available on Amazon in ebook or paperback. The title is Modern Masculinity for the Conscious Man.
Michael, I appreciate your time and honesty and openness to have these hard conversations. And I know that listeners will be definitely getting a lot out of this, particularly to hear it from the very start to the end. And the truth is, this is only the very, very, very surface level. I'm sure you get into so much more in your book, and obviously, in further thought and consciousness, and maybe, getting to that own place of taking our own free will to have our own thoughts and question and make up our minds. So, Michael, really appreciate your time and honesty, and thank you again for appearing on the show.
Nesh, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for hosting it.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.